Well, there's a follow-up to our story last night about a local couple finding the proverbial message in a bottle as they were strolling along the National Seashore. Turns out it's not the only one that has washed up along our coastline. The couple from yesterday, Jim and Candy Duke, found this decades-old bottle during one of their walks at Malaquite Beach. The message inside happened to be from NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. It was a part of a study looking at the currents and the movement of the shrimp population. More than 7,800 of those bottles had been dropped in the Gulf back in 1962. And today we learned many of those washed up bottles are now being kept at the Bell Library at Texas A&M Corpus Christi.
I think it's really interesting to see that this study was done in the 1960s, 1962, 1964. Most of these bottles were found in 1964, that they're still being found. That's really cool, and it shows that we preserve history for an important reason.
And she says there are about 30 of those bottle messages in their collection. The collection also has a map of where the bottles were dropped and where they were located, where they finally showed up along our coastline. Many of the bottles, they say, are still unaccounted for, so you never know what you might find next time you go out and visit the beach.